Salam sejahtera, anda bersama Nina Rozman dan ini Niaga Awani. Beberapa negara anggota ASEAN termasuk Malaysia secara asasnya bersetuju untuk menimbangkan penggunaan tenaga nuklear sebagai satu daripada sumber tenaga baharu di masa hadapan. Timbalan Perdana Menteri Datuk Seri Fadilah Yusof berkata, negara jiran yang mempertimbangkan penggunaan tenaga baharu itu adalah Singapura, Vietnam, Indonesia, Filipina, Myanmar dan Thailand. Katanya dalam usaha memastikan pembangunan ekonomi negara, bekalan tenaga kepada industri, terutamanya ekonomi digital seperti kecerdasan buatan AI dan pusat data yang menggunakan tenaga, Malaysia perlu memastikan bekalan tenaga yang terjamin. Maka kerajaan kini turut mempertimbangkan tenaga nuklear sebagai satu daripada sumbernya. Malah baru-baru ini di Korea Selatan dalam mesyuarat Menteri Tenaga Kerjasama Ekonomi Asia Pasifik APEC turut dipersetujui nuklear adalah satu daripada pilihan bagi negara-negara APEC untuk memastikan bekalan tenaga bersih. Dalam aspek keselamatan di rantau Asia, kata beliau, kebanyakan loji tenaga nuklear daripada generasi kedua hingga generasi ketiga berkembang dengan baik dari segi teknologi dan keselamatan alam sekitar serta penerimaan masyarakat dunia. Pada asasnya, negara-negara ini memutuskan untuk menggunakan tenaga nuklear sebagai satu daripada sumber mereka. Mengulas lanjut, Fadilah berkata, agensi di bawah Petra, MyPower sudah diberi peranan untuk melaksanakan kajian penggunaan tenaga nuklear. Namun penggunaan tenaga itu dijangka dilaksanakan dalam tempoh 10 hingga 15 tahun akan datang. Beliau berkata, selain penjanaan kuasa, negara juga perlu melihat kepada sistem grid pintar, memandangkan tenaga solar dan tenaga boleh baharu masih tidak stabil. Disebabkan itu, beliau berkata kerajaan kini sedang mengkaji untuk menambah baik sistem grid dan kembali kepada sistem grid pintar supaya ia lebih cekap dalam penyimpanan tenaga, penggunaan tenaga serta dapat dipantau. Penternak tempatan di negeri berhampiran sepadan Malaysia, Thailand termasuk Kelantan akan terkesan sekiranya penyeludupan haiwan ruminan terus berlaku. Menteri Pertanian dan Keterjaminan Makanan Datuk Seri Mohamad Sabu berkata kemasukan haiwan itu secara haram akan menggugat harga pasaran daging tempatan, malah menimbulkan risiko penularan penyakit daripada haiwan yang tidak disaring oleh Jabatan Veteriner. Katanya mengikut rekod, sebanyak 70,000 ekor lembu diseludup sepanjang tahun lalu. Sekiranya penyeludupan ini berterusan, penternak-penternak yang berdekatan dengan sempadan termasuk Kelantan dan Kedah akan terkesan. Jelasnya rakyat masih boleh menerima sekiranya harga daging RM25 hingga RM35 sekilogram secara umum. Namun apabila wujudnya penyeludupan, daging yang ditawarkan lebih murah sekaligus memberi masalah kepada penternak tempatan. Beliau sebelum itu hadir pada majlis perasmian kandang ternakan lembu Wagyu Kelfarm Sedang Berhad di Kampung Seribong dekat Kota Baru pada Ahad. Sehubungan itu, beliau menggesa semua pihak terlibat bekerjasama untuk mengatasi masalah penyeludupan tersebut. Sementara itu, Muhammad berkata kementeriannya kini dalam usaha meningkatkan pengeluaran daging berkualiti tinggi bagi memenuhi permintaan domestik serta mengurangkan kebergantungan import. Berdasarkan data ternakan lembu baka hybrid ternakan lembu Wagyu sehingga Jun lalu berjaya merekodkan hasil sebanyak 481 ekor berbanding pencapaian tahun 2024 hanya sekitar 393 ekor. Peningkatan ini menunjukkan permintaan yang semakin tinggi terhadap lembu Wagyu tempatan. Kerajaan tidak akan berkompromi terhadap mana-mana pihak yang cuba menjejaskan manfaat yang sepatutnya dinikmati rakyat menerusi pelaksanaan inisiatif penghargaan sumbangan asas rahmah sara. Menteri Kewangan kedua, Datuk Seri Amir Hamzah Azizan berkata pihaknya mengambil maklum dengan beberapa hantaran melalui media sosial yang mendakwa terdapat segelintir peniaga menaikkan harga barangan. Tegasnya, sekiranya perkara ini berlaku, siasatan dan tindakan di bawah Akta Kawalan Harga dan Anti Pencatutan 2011 boleh dilaksanakan. Kerajaan Madani katanya akan menyiasat aduan. Dalam masa yang sama, kerajaan menghargai inisiatif Pasaraya dan Kedai Runcit yang menawarkan harga istimewa kepada penerima manfaat. Beliau juga menggalakkan orang ramai untuk membuat aduan rasmi kepada Kementerian Perdagangan Dalam Negeri dan Kos Sara Hidup KPDN untuk membolehkan siasatan segera dijalankan. Aduan boleh dikemukakan melalui beberapa saluran KPDN seperti portal e-aduan KPDN, talian WhatsApp atau pusat talian seperti yang tertera. Dalam pada itu, MOF memaklumkan hari ke-8 pelaksanaan penghargaan sara berjalan lancar dengan jumlah jualan sebanyak RM102.5 juta melibatkan 1.7 juta penerima setakat pukul 9.30 Ahad malam. Kadar transaksi berjaya kekal stabil pada 99.9% bagi 2 hari berturut-turut. Kadar transaksi berjaya kekal stabil pada 99.9% bagi 2 hari berturut-turut. Usaha penambahbaikan dan perluasan kapasiti pemprosesan sistem sepanjang 7 hari lepas telah menyumbang kepada kestabilan sistem yang tercapai pada hari ini. Sejak dilaksanakan pada 31 Ogos, inisiatif berkenaan secara keseluruhannya telah memanfaatkan lebih 11.8 juta rakyat yang membeli barangan keperluan asas menggunakan kredit penghargaan sara dan sara bulanan dengan jumlah perbelanjaan mencecah 745.7 juta ringgit di seluruh negara. Kita akan teruskan dengan perkembangan mata wang ringgit yang dijangka meningkat berbanding dolar Amerika Syarikat minggu ini selepas data gaji bukan ladang NFP Amerika Syarikat yang dikeluarkan lebih rendah daripada jangkaan sekaligus meningkatkan harapan terhadap penurunan kadar faedah di negara itu bulan ini. Data NFP Amerika Syarikat mencatatkan hanya 22,000 pekerjaan baharu pada Ogos berbanding unjuran konsensus sebanyak 75,000, manakala kadar pengangguran meningkat kepada 4.3% daripada 4.2% pada bulan sebelumnya. Ketua Ahli Ekonomi Bank Muamalat Malaysia Berhad Dr. Muhammad Afzal Nizam Abdul Rashid berkata, perkembangan itu menunjukkan pasaran buruh Amerika Syarikat semakin lemah sekaligus mendorong Rizab Persekutuan Fed untuk memberi tumpuan kepada usaha menyokong pertumbuhan ekonomi. Sehubungan itu, kebarangkalian untuk berlaku penurunan kadar faedah pada mesyuarat jawatan kuasa pasaran terbuka Persekutuan FOMC pada 16 hingga 17 September semakin meningkat. Lebih penting lagi, Fed perlu membuktikan bahawa mereka mampu mengurus keadaan terutama apabila pentadbiran Amerika Syarikat pada masa ini mencabar kebebasan dasar monetari mereka. Muhammad Afzal Nizam berkata gandingan dolar Amerika Syarikat ringgit dijangka berada dalam julat antara RM4.20 hingga RM4.22 minggu ini. Bagi asas mingguan, ringgit menutup minggu lalu lebih rendah berbanding dolar Amerika Syarikat pada 4.2260 daripada 4.2230 sebelumnya. Mata wang tempatan itu bagaimanapun diniagakan lebih tinggi berbanding beberapa mata wang utama lain. Ringgit turut diniagakan kebanyakan rendah berbanding mata wang ASEAN kecuali berbanding dolar Singapura apabila meningkat kepada 3.2775 daripada 3.2859 pada akhir minggu lalu. Bank Negara Malaysia telah mengekalkan kadar dasar semalaman OPR pada paras 2.75%. Keputusan ini hadir dalam suasana ekonomi yang berkembang 4.4% pada separuh pertama 2025 dengan inflasi kekal sederhana dan pasaran buruh pada tahap guna tenaga penuh. Namun persoalan utama kini adakah kadar semasa mencukupi untuk terus merangsang pertumbuhan, menarik pelaburan strategik dan melindungi Malaysia daripada ketidaktentuan global yang semakin kompleks. Dengan itu kita mempersilakan tetamu yang sudah bersedia dalam talian untuk mengulas lebih lanjut. penerja adalah Dr. Muhammad Afzal Nizam Abdul Rashid, Ketua Ekonomi Bank Muamalat Malaysia Berhad. Saya nak ucapkan terima kasih Dr. kerana sudi meluangkan masa bersama kami. Pertama sekali melihat kepada OPR yang dikekalkan pada 2.75% dan ekonomi berkembang 4.4% pada separuh pertama tahun ini. Adakah langkah ini mencukupi untuk memastikan sasaran pertumbuhan dari tahun ini sehingga tahun 2026 tahun depan terus tercapai, terutama dalam persekitaran global yang semakin tidak menentu?
Terima kasih Nina. Kalau kita melihat apa yang diungkapkan dalam kenyataan Bank Negara Malaysia baru-baru ini, saya melihat kenyataan tersebut menunjukkan suatu optimisme yang mana situasi ekonomi yang disasarkan iaitu sekitar 4% hingga 4.8% bagi tahun ini boleh dicapai. Dan kalau kita melihat, mereka menyatakan bahawa masih lagi wujud apa dikatakan sebagai downside risk, tetapi darjah downside risk itu dilihat sedikit berkurangan, dan ini banyak disokong ataupun disumbang oleh ketidakpastian tarif itu telah mula menunjukkan sedikit kejelasan lah apabila tarif terbaru telah pun diumumkan yang mana ianya kadarnya itu berkurangan, dan terdapat beberapa lagi perubahan-perubahan yang sedang berlaku dari segi tarif bagi negara-negara yang lain. Jadi ini menunjukkan bahawa saya kira peluang untuk Malaysia terus berbincang dan berunding untuk mendapat satu deal yang terbaik pada masa akan juga akan dilihat boleh mampu untuk mengurangkan downside risk tersebut. Namun seperti yang disebut tentang situasi ekonomi Amerika Syarikat, terutamanya apabila melihat data terkini berkenaan dengan jumlah penciptaan pekerjaan itu dilihat rendah daripada jangkaan, dan kadar pengangguran juga di Amerika Syarikat sedikit meningkat bagi bulan Ogos yang lalu kepada 4.3%. Jadi ini menimbulkan sedikit persoalan lah, apakah momentum pertumbuhan ekonomi Amerika Syarikat pada masa depan, terutamanya tahun hadapan, akan terus lembab, dan pihak Fed dijangka akan menggunakan kadar faedah, dan apakah langkah yang boleh diambil oleh pihak kerajaan terutamanya dari segi dasar monetari yang ditadbir oleh Bank Negara Malaysia. Jadi kita sedang melihat suatu fasa yang mana kadar faedah sedang menurun, dan apakah situasi itu akan terus menular di negara kita pula.
Baik, itu adalah antara situasi yang boleh kita fahami dari peringkat domestik sehinggalah ke peringkat global apa yang sedang berlaku di Amerika Syarikat. Dan kalau kita lihat, BNM juga telah menyatakan keseluruhan inflasi dan teras kekal sederhana sekitar 1.4% hingga 1.9%. Kedua-duanya bawah 2%. Namun doktor, apakah antara downside risk yang tersembunyi yang kita tidak nampak yang boleh mencetuskan tekanan harga semula, khususnya daripada faktor luaran seperti kenaikan tarif ataupun kejutan komoditi global?
Baik, dari segi inflasi, saya kira jelas dari pendirian Bank Negara buat masa ini dilihat selesa dengan situasi inflasi yang mana dilihat terkawal, dan seperti yang Nina sebutkan tadi rendah dan sebagainya itu, maksudnya itulah situasi ataupun senario yang dilihat. Dan saya kira driver ataupun faktor utama yang akan mendorong inflasi ini sebenarnya banyak didorong oleh faktor pentadbiran, maksudnya subsidi, kawalan harga dan sebagainya. Dan apa yang kita sedia maklum, pihak kerajaan telah mengumumkan royalty 5 yang dari segi rasionalis subsidinya itu harganya akan lebih rendah lah. Jadi di situ saya kira pihak Bank Negara telah mengambil kira faktor tersebut, dan dari segi administered prices tersebut dilihat tidaklah akan menyumbang faktor yang utama lah dari segi inflasi ni, dan inflasi dilihat rendah bagi tahun ini. Jadi dari segi soalan downside ataupun apakah perkara yang akan melonjakkan inflasi, saya kira banyak berpaksikan faktor luaran seperti kejutan bagi harga komoditi, tetapi kita sedia maklum harga minyak ini dikawal dan melalui subsidi dan sebagainya itu. Jadi kesannya itu mungkin sedikit sebanyak dapat dikurangkan hasil daripada dasar tersebutlah.
Seperti yang telah dikongsikan oleh doktor, kalau kita lihat kebanyakan tekanan inflasi ini mungkin akan didorong oleh faktor luaran seperti kejutan harga komoditi. Namun kita lihat pada ketika ini inflasi masih terkawal dengan harga komoditi juga masih dalam keadaan yang terkawal. Dan saya akan beralih kepada pelaburan pula doktor, yang telah dijangka didorong oleh projek mega swasta dan awam serta pemangkin RMK ke-13. Jadi bagaimana kestabilan kadar faedah ini boleh mempercepatkan lagi pelaksanaan pelaburan ini, dan adakah ia sudah cukup untuk menarik lebih banyak FDI dalam sektor yang berimpak tinggi khususnya?
Kalau kita nak kaitkan dasar monetari dengan landscape pelaburan, saya kira sesuatu yang positif sebenarnya, kerana dari segi teorinya hubungan antara kadar faedah dan pelaburan ini dia berkadar songsang. Maksudnya kalau kadar faedah itu makin menurun, maka dia akan menggalakkan lagi aktiviti pelaburan. Dan saya kira dalam rancangan Malaysia yang ke-13, apa yang telah diumumkan, perbelanjaan pembangunan itu dilihat tinggi, iaitu 430 bilion bagi tempoh 5 tahun, dan saya kira ini merupakan satu pemangkin utama bagaimana aktiviti pelaburan itu akan dapat dipacu dan akan merangsang ataupun memberi kesan spillover effect pula kepada pelaburan swasta. Dan saya kira kerajaan juga ada menyebut tentang untuk meneruskan orang kata tu memberi fokus kepada projek-projek infrastruktur yang bersifat rakyat lah, maksudnya fokus kepada sekolah, hospital dan sebagainya. Itu juga saya kira akan memberi kesan langsung kepada aktiviti pelaburan, terutamanya dari segi aktiviti dalam sektor pembinaan lah.
Seperti yang Dr. kongsikan, kalau kita kaitkan dasar monetari dengan pelaburan ini adalah antara perkara yang baik. Namun saya nak tambah melihat juga kepada dasar fiskal, di mana sebelum saya sentuh kepada soalan dasar fiskal ni, BNM ada menekankan guna tenaga penuh dan pertumbuhan upah akan terus menyokong perbelanjaan isi rumah. Jadi bergerak ke hadapan, bagaimana untuk kita meneliti pula dasar monetari perlu diselarikan dengan dasar fiskal ini untuk memastikan kuasa beli rakyat tidak terhakis dalam jangka panjang, mengambil kira kita banyak ketidaktentuan.
Pertama, kalau kita lihat sebenarnya pihak Bank Negara begitu berhati-hati dalam menggunakan ruang dasar yang mereka ada. Memang tidak dinafikan mereka mempunyai ruang dasar. Ruang dasar ni maksudnya kebolehan mereka untuk menurunkan kadar faedah lah. Boleh sebenarnya kalau kita lihat inflasi itu rendah dan pertumbuhan ekonomi juga dalam keadaan baik, mereka boleh sebenarnya untuk menurunkan lagi. Tapi mereka begitu orang kata berhati-hati untuk menggunakan ruang tersebut kerana buat masa ini pertumbuhan ekonomi masih lagi baik, pasaran buruh dilihat dalam keadaan guna tenaga penuh. Jadi tiada keperluan lah untuk overstimulate di ekonomi lah. Tetapi pada masa sama juga sebenarnya kalau bercakap tentang kos hari hidup, peluang pekerjaan, itu sebenarnya melibatkan dasar fiskal lah. Maksudnya bagaimana aktiviti pelaburan itu akan dapat dirangsang melalui dasar fiskal. Itu juga membantu dalam meningkatkan taraf hidup rakyat. Jadi dia menggunakan beberapa dasar lah sebenarnya. Tapi saya kira dengan keadaan yang selesa oleh pihak Bank Negara ni, sepatutnya dia boleh menimbulkan satu bentuk keyakinan lah yang bahawa dasar kerajaan, dasar monetari itu dalam keadaan yang baik dan dalam sentiasa bersiap siaga untuk diguna pakai sekiranya terdapat keperluan untuk bertindak sedemikian rupa.
Dan mungkin akhir sekali kita lihat walaupun prospek global dilihat lebih positif dengan rundingan perdagangan yang mereda, risiko tetapi risiko ketidaktentuan ini tetap wujud, Doktor. Jadi bagaimana Malaysia harus seimbangkan antara mengekalkan dasar monetari akomodatif dan bersedia dengan langkah preemptif jika keadaan global kembali meruncing?
Kalau kita lihat dari segi kitaran ekonomi, saya kira kita dalam kitaran ekonomi yang sedang melembab lah. Dan ini jelas ditunjukkan oleh unjuran yang dibuat oleh pihak IMF, World Bank dan sebagainya. Dan di situ juga sebenarnya dia memberikan suatu signal ataupun isyarat bahawa dasar seperti dasar monetari dan dasar fiskal juga perlu diselaraskan dengan kesesuaian landscape ekonomi yang kita ada sekarang ni. Jadi ini saya kira sebenarnya pihak Bank Negara dalam sentiasa orang kata tu memantau momentum pertumbuhan ekonomi global dan kesan kepada ekonomi negara. Kalau terdapat keperluan seperti sebutkan tadi untuk menurunkan kadar faedah ataupun OPR itu tadi, sebenarnya Bank Negara dalam keadaan yang selesa untuk memperkenalkan dasar yang lebih akomodatif pada masa akan datang.
Doktor, akhir sekali kita sudah lihat prestasi separuh pertama tahun ini 44%. Apakah antara jangkaan ataupun unjuran doktor untuk separuh kedua tahun ini?
Separuh tahun kedua, saya melihat mungkin ekonomi akan lebih perlahan disebabkan oleh situasi tarif, dan kita lihat ekonomi Amerika Syarikat pun telah mula menunjukkan tanda-tanda yang melemah, dan saya kira ekonomi global juga dalam trajektori yang sama. Jadi saya kira pertumbuhan mungkin dalam sekitar 4% dalam untuk tempoh tahun yang separuh tahun yang kedua, yang mana akan membawa kepada pertumbuhan lebih rendah lah untuk bagi keseluruhan tahun 2025.
Dan kita lihat berdasarkan perkongsian doktor, keadaan ekonomi ketika ini stabil, OPR telah dikekalkan, inflasi juga masih terkawal walaupun ketidaktentuan masih wujud di peringkat global, namun banyak perbincangan dan rundingan dan pemantauan harus dilaksanakan pada masa akan datang agar kita lihat kesejahteraan ekonomi dan rakyat juga terjamin. Saya nak ucapkan terima kasih kepada Dr. Muhammad Azanizam Abdul Rashid, merupakan Ketua Ekonomi BEM Maulat Malaysia Berhad, dan setiap perbincangan ini akan kami rangkumkan dalam astro.awani.com dan di semua platform digital Astro Awani. Jangan ke mana-mana, banyak lagi laporan yang akan kami bawakan selepas ini.
September ini, Astro Home of Kids kembali lebih besar di Pavilion Exhibition Centre Bukit Jalil. Hidupkan keseronokan family di sini.
Saya Olga.
Temui rakan kegemaran anda.
That's perfect.
Masa untuk mereka masuk.
Sertai pelbagai aktiviti yang menyeronokkan.
Baguslah.
Want a fun join you?
Buddy, lawati peruai mereka.
Come here, boy.
Pelanggan Astro boleh menebus pas laluan pantas sesi foto dengan Astro Rewards. Buat dulu kalinya, konsert mini Diddy and Friends.
Hebatnya. Jom.
Astro Home of Kids di Pavilion Exhibition Centre Bukit Jalil. Mari bergembira bersama.
Asia tumpuan utama dunia. Dengan ekonomi yang semakin rancak, pembangunan lestari dan tenaga boleh diperbaharui, apakah pula impak kecerdasan buatan AI dalam perkembangan teknologi dan masa depan pekerjaan? Kami mendalami setiap berita dan cerita. Saksikan diskusi, dialog dan laporan khas di Agenda Awani Asia bersama koresponden khas kami setiap Sabtu 9 malam di semua platform Astro Awani.
5 lelaki penghantar makanan didakwa di Mahkamah Magistrate Bangi atas tuduhan membunuh seorang pemandu kereta lelaki dalam satu kejadian.
4 sungai di sekitar kawasan perindustrian Pasir Gudang di Johor termasuk Sungai Kim Kim didapati tercemar dan berada pada tahap yang membimbangkan. Kerajaan sudah mulakan inisiatif untuk menggantikan kenderaan operasinya kepada kenderaan elektrik EV dalam skala kecil terlebih dahulu.
Dagangan niaga hadapan minyak sawit mentah MSM di Bursa Malaysia Derivatives dijangka dalam julat lebih kecil minggu ini berikutan kekurangan pemangkin pasaran, kata peniaga komoditi itu David Ng. Beliau berkata harga diunjurkan dalam julat RM4,300 hingga RM4,480 satu tan. Sementara itu, Ketua Penyelidikan Komoditi Sunwin Group yang berpangkalan di Mumbai, Anil Kumar Bagani berkata, pasaran kini menunggu data Persatuan Minyak Sawit Malaysia mengenai anggaran pengeluaran minyak sawit Malaysia bagi Ogos. Beliau berkata stok minyak sawit Malaysia pada akhir Ogos dianggarkan 2.214 juta tan, meningkat 4.76% daripada 2.113 juta tan pada Julai, berikutan peningkatan pengeluaran sebanyak 1% kepada 1.831 juta tan. Bagi asas perbandingan mingguan, kontrak semasa September 2025 meningkat RM63 kepada RM4,371 satu tan, manakala kontrak Oktober 2025 menokok RM65 kepada RM4,412 satu tan. Kontrak November 2025 melonjak RM68 kepada RM4,448 satu tan. Disember 2025 naik RM67 kepada RM4,475, manakala Januari 2026 dan Februari 2026 masing-masing meningkat RM65 kepada RM4,490 dan RM4,482 satu tan. Jumlah dagangan mingguan berkurangan kepada 141,151 lot berbanding 294,986 lot pada minggu sebelumnya, manakala kepentingan terbuka menguncup pada 252,812 kontrak berbanding 253,380 kontrak sebelum ini. Harga fizikal MSM untuk September Selatan meningkat RM30 kepada RM4,400 satu tan. Pasaran ditutup pada Jumaat 5 September bersempena cuti umum Maulidur Rasul dan akan beroperasi semula pada Isnin 8 September. Bursa Malaysia dijangka kekal diniagakan dalam jajaran kecil dengan kecenderungan menaik sedikit pada minggu ini ketika para pelabur menunggu pemakin baharu untuk menentukan hala tuju pasaran. Naib Presiden Penyelidikan Ekuiti Rakuten Trade Sedang Berhad, Tong Pak Leng menjangkakan indeks petunjuk pasaran itu mengekalkan trend tidak berubahnya dengan kecenderungan menaik sederhana sehingga pemacu baharu muncul. Beliau berkata ia menjangkakan indeks itu bergerak dalam jajaran 1,570 hingga 1,600 mata pada minggu ini, menunjukkan tahap sokongan dan rintangannya. Pak Lim berkata indeks petunjuk pasaran itu bergerak antara paras 1,570 dan 1,580 mata pada minggu lalu, berikutan ketiadaan pemangkin baharu, manakala aliran keluar asing yang berterusan menghadkan momentum menaik. Minggu ini, peserta pasaran akan menunggu pengumuman data ekonomi baharu termasuk indeks pengeluaran perindustrian dan nilai jualan pembuatan Malaysia. Manakala di Amerika Syarikat, pengumuman data utama termasuklah indeks harga pengguna, indeks harga pengeluar dan tututan pengangguran awal. Bagi asas mingguan, FBM KLCI meningkat 3.03 mata kepada 1,578.15 pada Khamis daripada 1,575.12 pada Jumaat minggu sebelumnya. Pasaran ditutup pada Jumaat minggu lepas sempena cuti umum Hari Maulidur Rasul. Laporan pekerjaan bagi bulan Ogos menunjukkan prestasi yang lebih lembut daripada jangkaan. Non-farm payrolls hanya meningkat sebanyak 22,000 berbanding unjuran konsensus sebanyak 75,000. Bacaan yang lebih perlahan ini dijangka mengukuhkan lagi jangkaan terhadap pemotongan kadar faedah oleh Federal Reserve bulan ini, malah berdasarkan data CME FedWatch. Kebarangkalian pasaran terhadap langkah pemotongan pada mesyuarat FOMC bulan September melonjak kepada 100% pada pagi Jumaat. Sejurus selepas data menunjukkan pertumbuhan pekerjaan Ogos jauh lebih rendah daripada unjuran. Jadi apakah kesan kepada ekonomi Malaysia sekiranya Bank Rizab Persekutuan Amerika Syarikat mengambil langkah drastik memotong kadar faedah dalam mesyuarat minggu hadapan? Dan sudah bersedia dalam talian untuk mengulas lebih lanjut adalah Muhammad Siddiq Jantan, pengarah strategi pelaburan dan ahli ekonomi IPP Wealth Managers Limited. Saya nak ucapkan terima kasih Siddiq kerana sudi meluangkan masa bersama kami. Kita teruskan dengan perkembangan di peringkat antarabangsa. Apakah antara faktor utama yang mendorong Federal Reserve ni untuk turunkan lagi kadar faedah pada bulan September? Apakah antara jangkaannya?
Okey, baik Nina. Kalau kita tengok faktor utama Federal Reserve untuk menurunkan kadar faedah, kalau kita tengok adalah keseimbangan antara apa yang kita dapat lihat mandate Federal Reserve untuk mengekalkan inflasi pada paras 2% dan memastikan guna tenaga pada peringkat maksimum. So kalau kita tengok tadi data pasaran buruh terkini menunjukkan bukan sahaja pertambahan pekerjaan yang perlahan tetapi juga tanda-tanda pelemahan struktur antara pengangguran yang meningkat dan juga pertumbuhan upah yang sederhana dan tempoh bekerja yang lebih singkat. So ini menunjukkan pasaran buruh tidak lagi terlalu ketat seperti tahun lalu. Dalam konteks teori ekonomi, kalau kita tengok pun untuk ekonomi monetari, apabila tekanan inflasi berkurangan dan risiko kelembapan pertumbuhan semakin tinggi, Bank Pusat mempunyai asas yang kukuh untuk melonggarkan dasar bagi mengekalkan ekonomi terjerumus ke dalam kemelesetan teknikal. So oleh itu, pemotongan kadar faedah bukan sekadar reaksi kepada data pekerjaan Ogos tetapi refleksi kepada peralihan strategi Fed daripada inflation fighting kepada growth stabilization.
Dan bagaimana pemotongan kadar faedah oleh Fed boleh memberi kesan kepada pasaran kewangan Malaysia, Siddiq?
Okey, kalau kita tengok ni dah, kalau pemotongan kadar faedah Amerika Syarikat ataupun mana-mana, dia akan melemahkan mata wang negara itu sendiri. So ambil contoh untuk kadar faedah Amerika Syarikat, kalau dia kalau Federal Reserve memotong kadar faedah seperti 25 basis point, ianya akan melemahkan dolar Amerika Syarikat dan mengurangkan yield differential. So sekaligus memperkukuhkan mata wang negara lain. Seperti contoh kalau kita nak buat korelasi di sini adalah ringgit Malaysia. So ringgit akan lebih stabil, menurunkan kos import makanan, bahan mentah dan juga tenaga serta dia mengurangkan tekanan inflasi terimport. So ini memberi ruang kepada bank negara untuk mengekalkan dasar monetari yang lebih akomodatif sekaligus menyokong kestabilan harga dan juga permintaan domestik. So BNM juga kalau kita tengok dia dah bertindak secara pramuat ataupun preemptive dengan mengurangkan kadar OPR 25 basis point pada bulan Julai yang lalu. So daripada 3% kepada 2.75%. So langkah ini akan mengurangkan risiko kejutan sekiranya tiba-tiba Fed daripada seperti tadi Nina kata jangkaan sebanyak 25 basis point tetapi tiba-tiba Fed mengurangkan 50 basis point ataupun 100 basis point. So keadaan yang ataupun langkah yang diambil oleh BNM ini dapat mengurangkan risiko kejutan. So strategi ini kalau kita lihat dia membolehkan Malaysia menyerap kesan global dengan lebih stabil dan juga terutamanya terhadap imbangan pembayaran, kedudukan fiskal negara dan juga daya tahan sektor swasta.
Baik, itu adalah antara kesan pemotongan kadar faedah kepada kewangan lanskap kewangan Malaysia. Jadi, adakah langkah Fed ini mampu menjadi katalis kepada pertumbuhan ekonomi Malaysia?
Okey, kalau kita tengok langkah Fed menurunkan kadar faedah memang akan memberi sedikit kelebihan ataupun menjadi pembangkit kepada pertumbuhan ekonomi Malaysia, terutamanya kalau kita tengok untuk saluran ekspor. So ringgit yang lebih stabil dan juga kos pembiayaan luaran yang lebih rendah mampu mengukuhkan daya tahan ataupun daya saing ekspor Malaysia khususnya dalam sektor E&E yang sangat bergantung kepada permintaan global. So jika permintaan luaran pulih, ini boleh menyokong pertumbuhan ekspor dan juga meningkatkan penggunaan kapasiti dan seterusnya memperbaiki bacaan indeks pengurusan pembelian PMI, perbuatan yang kini berada pada tahap sederhana walaupun kita nampak PMI itu dalam bentuk uptrend pada 49.9 dan kita melihat sekiranya Fed menurunkan kadar faedah ianya akan menganjak PMI itu kepada paras 50 ke atas. So selain itu peningkatan ekspor berpotensi mewujudkan lebih banyak peluang pekerjaan, itu sedia maklum dalam sektor perkilangan dan logistik, sekaligus dia menyokong pendapatan isi rumah. So dalam masa yang sama kadar faedah global yang lebih rendah turut meningkatkan daya tarikan Malaysia sebagai destinasi pelaburan langsung asing FDI, terutamanya industri yang berorientasikan ekspor. So kita boleh lihat aliran masuk FDI bukan sahaja dia memperkukuhkan asas produktiviti jangka panjang, tapi dia juga dapat memperluaskan rantaian bekalan tempatan dan meningkatkan teknologi dan pada masa yang sama menambah baik keupayaan modal insan. So ini yang kita boleh nampak katalis ataupun benefit kepada Malaysia.
Banyak aspek-aspek kita lihat benefit kepada Malaysia seperti yang dikongsikan, dapat peningkatan daripada segi ekspor, peningkatan peluang pekerjaan, pembiayaan luar yang lebih rendah dan sekaligus meningkatkan lagi daya saing ekspor Malaysia, terutamanya dalam sektor E&E yang kita lihat mempunyai peningkat permintaan global yang sangat tinggi. Jadi Siddiq, apakah antara risiko kita melihat kepada downside risk kepada Malaysia walaupun Fed menurunkan kadar faedah? Apakah possible scenario?
Okey, kalau kita tengok untuk possible scenario, risiko utama adalah daripada kelembapan ekonomi global yang boleh menekan ekspor Malaysia. So kita tahu tentang risiko tarif dan juga tarif-tarif yang diumumkan oleh Presiden Donald Trump dan juga geopolitikal ini akan memberi kesan kepada kelembapan ekonomi global. Dan ini kalau kita tengok untuk Malaysia, seperti saya katakan tadi, sektor elektrik dan elektronik yang menyumbang lebih daripada sepertiga daripada jumlah dagangan. So kelemahan permintaan ini berpotensi menjejaskan sektor perbuatan serta mengurangkan peluang pekerjaan dalam perkilangan dan juga logistik. So selain itu, inflasi import kekal sebagai risiko jika harga makanan dan tenaga global meningkat meskipun ringgit dilihat lebih stabil. So tambahan pula dasar perdagangan Amerika Syarikat yang saya katakan tadi tu dia boleh menghadkan akses pasaran Malaysia. So justru manfaat daripada pelonggaran Federal Reserve mungkin terhad sekiranya risiko luaran seperti yang saya sebutkan tadi iaitu risiko tarif, geopolitikal berlanjutan. Tapi kalau buat masa ni kalau tanya pada saya dengan kadar inflasi Malaysia pada 1.2 dan juga kedudukan unemployment rate pada 3.0, ini adalah keadaan data ekonomi Malaysia yang sihat. So kita tidak nampak downside risk ni lebih banyak. So kita boleh nampak kebanyakan benefit yang diterima oleh negara-negara membangun seperti Malaysia daripada penurunan kadar Fed yang bakal dilakukan pada bulan September ini.
Baik, saya nak ucapkan terima kasih kepada Siddiq kerana bantu kami faham apakah antara unjuran ataupun bagaimanakah situasi yang bakal berlaku di bulan September terutamanya daripada peringkat Federal Reserve dan apakah antara kesan-kesan pemotongan kadar faedah daripada peluang sehinggalah risiko untuk Malaysia, dan sudah tentu setiap perbincangan ini akan kami rangkumkan dalam astrawani.com dan di semua platform digital Astrawani, dan kita akan teruskan dengan perkembangan Awani International. South Korea is set to bring home its citizens detained in the US following a major raid at a Hyundai plant in Georgia. Talks between Seoul and Washington have wrapped up, and a plane will be dispatched once paperwork is complete. Most of the detainees are Korean nationals. Presidential Chief of Staff Kang Hun-sik says the government will also review visa procedures to prevent similar incidents. The raid led by US federal agents was the largest single-site enforcement operation in Homeland Security's history.
정부 부처와 경제단체, 기업이 한마음으로 신속하게 대응한 결과 구금되어 있는 근로자들의 석방 교섭이 마무리되었습니다. 다만 행정 절차만 남아있고 이 행정 절차가 마무리되는 대로 전세기가 우리 국민 여러분을 모시러 출발합니다. 향후 유사 사례 재발 방지를 위해 우리 산업부 및 관련 기업군과 공조하에 대미 프로젝트 관련 출장자의 체류 지휘와 비자 체계를 점검, 개선하는 방안을 추진할 것입니다.
U.S. job growth in August weakened significantly, with the unemployment rate rising to 4.3%, its highest in nearly 4 years, signaling a softening labour market and strengthening the case for a Federal Reserve rate cut this month. The Labour Department reported that the economy lost jobs in June for the first time in 4.5 years. Economists attribute the slowdown to President Donald Trump's import tariffs and immigration policy, which have reduced the labour pool. In July, unemployment individuals outnumbered job vacancy for the first time since the pandemic. Trump's tariffs, now at their highest since 1934, raised inflation concerns and led the Fed to pause rate cuts. Although trade uncertainty was easing, a recent court ruling declared many tariffs illegal, adding to business instability. Non-farm payrolls rose by just 22,000 in August, down from a revised 79,000 in July. June's figures were also revised to show a loss of 13,000 jobs. The unemployment rate ticked up from 4.2%, partly due to increased labour force participation. Some of August's weakness may be seasonal, as initial counts often understate job growth. Still, the 3-month average has dropped to 29,000 jobs per month, compared to 82,000 in the same period last year. Healthcare led job gains with 31,000 new positions, though below its 12-month average of 42,000, indicating strain even in traditionally strong sectors.
New hiring is truly ground to a halt, and that's a dynamic we've really seen in place since April when tariffs were announced. We're seeing a high degree of caution on the part of employers and not much luck for those who are in the job market or looking to assess what their future prospects might be for their careers. Right now, we're seeing an unemployment rate that's still strong by historical standards, but the level of new hiring is quite dismaying. And the fact that we saw contraction in a recent month, meaning a job loss, really speaks to the anemic showing that the job market is exhibiting as we speak. If you look beneath the headline numbers, the sector participation is among the areas that point to weakness in the job market. And for several months now, we've really been seeing sort of the recession-resistant sectors, healthcare and social assistance, do a lot of the heavy lifting of hiring. And that broad situation is not one where there is any heavy lifting going on. We did see some improvement here in retail and leisure and hospitality. But that area, those two areas which previously had been quite dynamic in the reopening of the U.S. economy, have been rather lackluster in recent months.
Please stay with us. My colleague Nina Rozman will take over and we'll be right back.
ada yang perdebatan bahawa GST perlu dikembalikan semula kerana ada yang mempertikaikan bahawa SST itu tidak efektif.
Isu buruh kanak-kanak bukan sahaja dalam bentuk fizikal tetapi juga bentuk moden yang lebih licik dan juga terselindung.
Kita tengok buruh kanak-kanak dan ada juga buruh paksa kanak-kanak.
Kumpulan FB dikenali sebagai grup budak-budak sekolah rendah yang didakwa menyebarkan gambar remaja perempuan tidak senonoh telah pun ditutup.
Rumah tu terlampau banyak luka untuk aku patah balik.
Tiada lagi peluang kedua.
Salah belanja aiskrim. Siapa nak aiskrim? Siapa lelaki yang selalu ada dengan kalsum tu?
Bahagia menanti.
Terus nak apa tak? Kahwin. Memang kahwin? Nak bodoh?
Apalah.
Hati si kecil diuji.
Ros ada dengan awak tak?
Tak ada pula.
Saya baru je sampai sekolah ni tapi Ros tak ada.
Ros?
Ros!
Rumah tanpa luka. Di Astro dan Astro Go. When the superpowers move, the ground shifts. Power isn't just about might anymore. It's about narratives, networks, negotiation. We go beyond the noise to deliver laser-focused analysis on how power moves and what it means for the world. This is AWANI International, reporting the shifts in power affairs shaping the world.
Perusahaan kecil dan sederhana, impian besar. Jiwa SME Astro AWANI kembali menjelajah Malaysia. Dari Ipoh ke Kota Kinabalu, dari Melaka ke Lembah Kelang. Sesi pitching, pameran produk dan dialog bersama pemimpin industri serantau. Dapatkan inspirasi, ilmu dan peluang untuk kembangkan perniagaan anda semuanya di bawah satu bumbung. Kerana inilah medan impak sebenar. Jiwa SME menjana impak, inovasi digital.
Hello and welcome to Niaga Spotlight with me, Nina Rozman. Niaga Spotlight takes us through the week in economic analysis and future affairs. Now today on analysis, our spotlight falls on the 100 ringgit SARA rollout and looking at whether it could be a subsidy revolution or just a stopgap. Now, over the Merdeka weekend, the government rolled out Bantuan SARA, the 100 ringgit credited into the MyCards of 22 million Malaysians, injecting roughly 2 billion ringgit into the economy overnight. Now, in just the first 2 days, more than 1.7 million people had already spent 110 million ringgit at stores nationwide. But this surge wasn't without strain. Terminals buckled, queues grew, and the government had to boost the MyCase system's capacity by 20% just to keep up. And yet, the biggest story goes beyond glitches. For some Malaysians, 100 ringgit disappears perhaps in a cafe meal, a treat. For others, it feeds a family for a week. That relativity reminds us why design matters. Is this the start of a digital subsidy revolution that could one day potentially deliver fuel, healthcare, even microfinance? Or is it a one-off relief that exposes more flaws than fixes? This morning on Niaga Spotlight, we unpack the economics, the technology, and the human reality behind the Bantuan SARA 100 ringgit rollout. An absolute pleasure to welcome to studios now, looking at Derek Cox, Senior Research Analyst with the Jeffrey Chan Institute on Southeast Asia at Sunway University, joined together with Vishnavi Charlotte, Program Manager with Social and Economic Research Initiative, Surrey. Very good morning to the both of you. Thank you so much for making time. How are we both doing?
Great. Thank you so much for having us, Nina. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having us on the show.
Fantastic. So, Derek, perhaps we can get started off by setting the scene and looking at the digital rails. Of course, plenty of quite justified criticism has also come out for the hiccups that were faced with the 100 ringgit rollout. But if we, let's say, move the SARA onto open e-wallets, such as we've got Do It Now QR, we've got GrabPay, how do we then balance ease of access with the risk of leakages or even potential misuse?
Thank you for that question. Whenever we speak about welfare programs like, SARA, the question that we have to grapple with is whether do we want to prioritize reaching those who deserve it, or do we want to exclude the wrong people who don't deserve the aid? It may seem a very, unimportant distinction, but historically all over the world, we see that a lot of costs and resources are spent on making sure that the wrong people do not get access to these kind of programs. So when we talk about widening access and we talk about what do we want a functional, progressive social protection system, how does that look like? It basically
we should prioritize access to the most, if possible. So, and when we talk about leakages, right, you mentioned leakages, you mentioned potential barriers. There's been a lot of administrative systems that have been built, to make sure, to ensure that we reach the right people and we exclude the wrong people. We've seen how in Malaysia, for instance, the petrol subsidy scheme in 2019 cost about 25 million. So when we speak about leakages, we always assume it's related to the program itself, right? What kinds of potential abuse can arise. But we don't talk about how when the administrative system that has been built to exclude the wrong people ends up being a leakage in itself. 25 million to set up a software system just to do that, whereas that resource could have been directed directly towards the rakyat. We also need to talk about leakages from restrictive options itself. For instance, SARA, you are only allowed to purchase from 14 categories, right?
That's right, exactly. Now, I think you've made some really salient points over there, but at the same time, looking at systems that don't cost us too much, just a point of reflection, the fact that by the end of 2024, about 2.6 million do-it-now QR merchants had already gone live everywhere around Malaysia. So that might be an example of showing us that scaling is immediately possible, and you do not necessarily need to invest that much in a closed loop system.
Exactly my point, because these systems already exist. And in Malaysia, I think the use rate for e-wallet system is about 88%, which is really, really high.
Even in rural areas, not just urban hubs,
88%.
right?
And in fact, in rural areas, for instance, where, digital access is a problem, this can perform as a way to incentivize the adoption of more digital tools and again, become a blueprint for the government to use this as a welfare redistribution modality.
Absolutely. And we also have regional neighboring examples too. Singapore has its CDC vouchers, which actually show wide access can actually work. And at the same time, it has real-time fraud detection built into the system. Very interesting indeed. Vaishnavi, I'd love to go into Siri's perspective and your work with vulnerable groups. And first of all, let's lay it out for everyone watching. 100 ringgit stretches very differently depending on the socio-economic background of individuals. For, let's say, a rural family in East Malaysia versus an urban renter in KL. Let's dig deeper.
Okay, so I think when you think about how 100 ringgit stretches between the urban and rural, right, it comes down to living cost. So living costs in Malaysia vary greatly between the urban and the rural, and according to the Department of Statistics Malaysia, in 2023, the average monthly household expenditure for the urban household averages around about 5,040 ringgit, whereas when it comes to rural households, it averages around 3,631 ringgit. So when you think about it that way, for urban families in KL, 100 ringgit can help ease part of the grocery burden for the month, but it does not meaningfully reduce the overall stress of rising food costs and rising food insecurity in the urban areas. So with nearly 80% of Malaysians now living in urban areas, food security is less about availability and it comes down more about affordability. And if you take a look at rural communities, the cost of living appears lower, mainly because many households rely on locally sourced produce to put food on the table. So this doesn't necessarily mean that 100 ringgit stretches significantly further either. So access and availability remain critical challenges in the rural communities. For families in Sabah and Sarawak, if you think about it, where poverty rates remain among one of the highest in Malaysia, rural households are often more vulnerable. So poor roads, limited connectivity, especially reliance on goods shipped from Peninsular Malaysia, mean that disruption from either weather or even fuel price hikes makes food availability unstable, and it also drives up costs.
So you're adding on those logistics costs in addition to the fact that it already costs you X amount to get there.
Yes. So if you think about it, if it already costs you X amount to get there, shipping these products from Peninsular Malaysia to Sabah Sarawak will also increase the price there. I remember on my visit to Sarawak once, I saw a loaf of bread costed close to 9 to 10 ringgit, and that genuinely shocked me. And that's when I realized that a lot of these goods, the prices are being hiked up to cover the transportation costs. So among that, the approved list of items under the SARA program includes staples like rice, oil, instant noodle, cleaning supplies, like what Derek mentioned, the 14 categories, right? So these are valuables but they only cover around 10% of an urban family's grocery bills. So leaving out essentials like meat, vegetables, and other raw ingredients that most Malaysian households depend on for food, if you think about it. So for rural households, the list is useful, but not always practical. So many already grow and source their own raw produce, making their living costs over there lower. But if you add in the aspect of these 14 categories, does it really help them in terms of this one-off 100 ringgit cash aid? So that's the kind of things we need to think about. And another important aspect is that 100 ringgit is universal for all Malaysians above 18 with a My Card, right?
That's right.
So this means whether you're a single renter in KL or even if you're a rural parent supporting children, the relief is the same, but the lived impact is different. So
Very
for
true.
wealthier
and maybe how many adults also there are in a home, which in a way also did, in a sense, contribute to the overflow of individuals who were there at payment terminals over the long weekend.
And I think if you look at it, I think when you think about a household with maybe 2 children, 2 parents, 2 children above 18, that's multiple My Cards trying to be used for maybe a single grocery bill purchase. So thinking about the logistics of that as well should have been taken into consideration before day one of the rollout of the SARA program. So another thing to consider is for wealthier households, right? The amount may feel small and symbolic, but many donate their aid to others in need, which is a great thing to see, and it shows Malaysian support for solidarity. But for lower income households, it is helpful but still insufficient to address the deeper challenges of affordability.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's very interesting because our preliminary qualitative questions that have been posed to store owners such as Maiden, etc., that saw a huge volume of SARA uptake. They've already clearly stated we are seeing rice, eggs and bread and big bags, 10 kgs of rice, as well as trays and trays of eggs and even loaves and loaves of bread being top on the list of what Malaysians are redeeming with their 100 ringgit. Derek, so to dig deeper into the categorization of this specific 100 ringgit My Card rollout, tell us more about what are some of the risks of, in that sense, dictating what can and cannot be purchased, and perhaps looking beyond that paradigm too.
Yeah, I think ultimately individuals know your finances best, right?
Sure.
Financial needs change every month, every week, every day, right? And a lot of times those financial needs don't just revolve around basic household items, which is what these 14 categories revolve on. But the interesting thing as well, that aside from these 14 categories, you're actually not allowed to purchase fresh fruits, fresh poultry. Those are excluded. So what is the rationale behind that, right?
There's the rationale of, I think, essentials versus also all the items you need, nutrition value.
Yeah, and of course, and these are products with nutrition value, which in Malaysia, we actually have issues of affordability when it comes to more nutritious items. And the interesting thing is that usually we will impose this kind of restrictions for programs to avoid the use of temptation goods, for instance, alcohol and cigarettes. Although something to share, evidence actually shows that in many countries, cash transfers and welfare aid like this don't actually increase the use and purchase of tobacco and alcohol. And in fact, if the government's rationale of having these 14 categories was to prevent the use of this or purchase of this kind of temptation goods, instead of 14 approved categories, the government could just have one restricted category, And it still doesn't answer the question as to why essential items which are nutritious, such as fresh goods, are not included.
Absolutely. I think you've raised some very interesting points there, including the fact that this is actually supported by World Bank global data, which shows less than a 3% incidence of misuse when it comes to rolling out without restrictions as well. Neighboring Indonesia, they also quite recently updated their food delivery program, the program Sembako, to actually widen the scope of what items are covered. So it's clearly showing that there are regional examples, but what would it take to perhaps move away from the idea around having to dictate in a rather paternalistic manner what those who are particularly from the B40 vulnerable groups can and cannot purchase?
I mean, it's sad because the assumption when it comes to this kind of policy making is that the B40 lack financial literacy or, a certain savviness when it comes to purchases. That, you know, again, it's the state paternalism that it knows best, and the poor and the B40 don't know any better. But research and data and evidence doesn't, you know, support that. In fact, we find that it is the issue of access and affordability that is the main hurdle over here. So using, for instance, like, you know, if we widen up accessibility to this, to SARA, what we can do is actually empowering, you know, individuals to make informed decisions when it comes to their financial situations. Because ultimately, like I mentioned earlier, if you are a parent with a child, your financial needs change all the time. It could be the fact that tomorrow, you know, my child is sick and I need expensive antibiotics. Next week, my motorbike breaks down and I need that for my job, you know, in an informal market.
That's right.
All that affects income as well. And when we restrict, although, you know, it's well-intentioned, when we restrict the spending of recipients, what we're actually doing is creating perverse incentives for people to try and beat the system, because the reality is that they're not getting the aid that they need. Just to quote an example, a few years ago, we had the program, book voucher program, that was given out to students. I'm not sure if any of you remember that.
That's right, yes.
What we saw was that people were actually taking those book vouchers to bookstores and trying to sell them for a lower value. Now, that's an example of a leakage in government spending, because let's say if the government gives you 200 ringgit, you only get 100 ringgit, because the other 100 ringgit goes to the shop that you sold those vouchers to. Why does this happen? It's because the aid that you're getting is, you're not, the need that you have is not being met.
It's a mismatch, clearly, in design. Yeah. So I think where we perhaps what needs to be done at this point in time, because we also have till the 31st of December for the rollout to be complete in this cycle, we can actually put in place mechanisms that hopefully help to address this, right? Now, Vaishnavi, then going deeper into looking at trust under strain when such systems are rolled out, right? So when people are queuing, transactions are failing, of course, it does damage a certain amount of confidence in government aid. So how can this be constructively addressed now that, of course, it has clearly come out as a potential issue?
Thank you, Tamina. So if you think about it, right, one of the SARA's program's greatest strength is its simple redemption system via the MyCard. So this ease of access makes it user-friendly for millions of Malaysians. But as Suri has highlighted in our recent statement, when systems encourage glitches and experience of receiving aid matters just as much as the aid itself. So how people get that aid and how they get to redeem that aid matters so much more than receiving that aid itself, because that is what increases people's trust in the government, right? So if system fails and the queues are long and people have to pay in cash when their credit doesn't come through, these are things that reinforce the trust that, the distrust that we have in the government. So on 31st of August, we saw how transaction failures and long queues created real frustration. A lot of recipients faced both practical and psychological harm because of this. So some even paid cash despite having the SARA credit.
That's right.
So these incidents can shake public trust. When promised aid does not drive smoothly and households start doubting whether systems are reliable, this brings up a whole different myriad of problems. So even if the problem is temporary, the memory of failure, it lingers. So confidence is especially fragile for vulnerable groups, if you think about it. If some succeed in redeeming the cash aid, but others are turned away due to like technical errors, it creates a source of unfairness, and it also breeds resentment. So elderly people, the rural, the poor, even undocumented individuals, when it may even stop trying, believing that the system is stacked up against them. So the broader implication is that the SARA program and similar programs are highly visible symbols of government care. But if the system fails, it doesn't just damage the program, it risks undermining faith in Malaysians' transition to a digital public service more generally. So in order to prevent this, some recommendations and some practical measures that we have included is basically staggered go live. So making sure that when cash aids are dispersed, we have a staggered release so that there's no overload in the system. So I think with the SARA program, when close to millions of Malaysians were going and redeeming everything on 31st of August, systems shut down, people were frustrated. So
I mean, it's a very symbolic day, but it's also a national public holiday.
Yes, exactly. So we need to think about the feasibility of that. So thinking about how we can stagger the rollouts. Another thing that we can do is also like real-time status dashboards. So making sure that the system is monitored, whatever complaints that come in, appeals that come in are addressed live, and so that people can see transparency that the government is collaborating with them to fix these issues. So to build more trust within the people and the government. And then also another thing is, for example, when people had to use their own cash when the credits didn't approved, making sure there's some kind of fallback. So either secure e-vouchers or even some sort of claim later reimbursements for families who've had to use cash but later on can claim back from their SARA credit. So these are all things that we need to think about when rolling out such a big program, especially on such a symbolic day. So the key message here is relief must be reliable. Malaysians have shown that they are ready for digital social protection, and the task now is ensuring that every single transaction builds rather than erodes confidence in the government.
Absolutely, and I think you raised a couple of key areas there for reflection and also improvement. In particular, of course, tempers ran high because some families had to actually pay a little more than what was anticipated because they were not able to redeem the 100 ringgit per individual. So that points to the fact that perhaps you need to have those immediate vouchers on standby for, let's say, a certain proportion, maybe 20% of transactions. Instead of, yes, it was admirable how the MyKase system was able to be boosted in capacity by 20% quite immediately, but the moment peak hour came the next day, on the 1st of September, once again, the surges caused systems to crash. Yeah. Anything that you're observing overall from these areas?
I mean, the other thing is that it's not only the fact that some families had to pay cash, but many families had to abandon their trolleys at these places and walk away. Now, of course, social media says that it's because, they couldn't get a bargain, but at the end of the day, these aren't luxury items. These are absolutely essential items like eggs, rice, and bread, and families are literally walking away, from the cash point because they don't have the 100 ringgit that they were supposed to be able to use. And I think it shows us how dire the situation is when it comes to, cost of living, although many are saying, oh yes, this is just, an attempt of Malaysian citizens trying to get a good bargain.
Yes, but again, look at the actual content of the baskets.
They are not luxury items. They're absolute essentials.
Thank you. Thanks, Derek. Thanks, Vishnavi. We do take a short break and we'll be right back after to continue the discussion. Don't go anywhere.
Dalam kegelapan, mereka membawa keadilan.
Banyak operasi kita buat untuk kita tumpaskan sindiket ni tak settle.
Mungkin ada orang lain yang terlibat.
Dia dah muncul balik.
Kau nampak lega aku tak mati. Kau nak apa ni? Aku nak kau seniara dua.
Apa ni?
Ini dia live tadi.
Lepas apa dia buat dengan dua? Aku bunuh kau tengok.
Dapatkah Tarik menyelamatkan Radwa? Tarik Risua, His Treasure, Rabu dan Kamis, 9 malam di Astro dan Astro Go.
Daulat Tuanku.
Tariffs on imports of products from China reaching up to 145%.
Tariffs on the rest of the world are sitting at 10%, with the potential for reciprocal tariffs to be reimposed within 90 days.
Kunjungan rasmi Presiden China ke Malaysia ini menunjukkan komitmen kedua-dua negara untuk meningkatkan hubungan diplomatik ke tahap yang lebih strategik.
When the superpowers move, the ground shifts. Power isn't just about might anymore. It's about narratives, networks, negotiation. We go beyond the noise to deliver laser-focused analysis on how power moves and what it means for the world. This is AWANI International, reporting the shifts in power affairs shaping the world.
Welcome back to Niaga Spotlight. Still with me, Tamina Kausri. And today we're discussing the 100 ringgit SARA rollout and whether we're looking at more of a subsidy revolution or perhaps a stopgap measure. Derek, continuing with the conversation and looking in particular at income thresholds. Now, many Malaysians, of course, they earn uneven wages. So in the case of such a rollout and also future potential rollouts, how do we actually look at families who may then risk being cut off once they move up, perhaps even just a few tens of ringgits into a different income category, but then that does not really decrease their vulnerability overall?
Yeah, thanks, Amina. I think what you just described there is a textbook case in social policy. We call it the cliff effect. And literally what happens is that, when the income increases even a little, the cliff effect is such that they may even lose more in terms of the subsidies and aid that they get, simply because the income went up just a little. And this is an inevitable and direct result of targeting mechanisms. So when you deliver aid strictly based on income and poverty targeting mechanisms, this is a direct effect. So how do we move forward here, right? And how do we avoid that happening? The answer is basically moving towards progressive universalization. That was quite a mouthful. And really, we see that actually in SARA. So although, critics have been pointing out that the 100 ringgit may not be enough, but what I see SARA as is that it's a potential game changer, because in Malaysia and actually in the social policy world, a lot of focus is on poverty targeting. Let's look at the B40. But the reality here is that in Malaysia, the vulnerability of many working individuals in Malaysia is such that they are just one sudden financial shock or emergency away. So instead of the B40, we're looking at data that perhaps shows us that it's not B40, but B80, simply by how vulnerable large segments of the population is, which tells us that a large segment of the population require aid and help from the government. So how do we move forward, right? And I mentioned SARA because it is the first time that something has been given universally without looking at income. And that is a potential window for us to basically normalize and sensitize the idea of more universal welfare programs. Of course, that requires cost, that requires money, a lot of resources. But how do we do it? We need to move towards income or poverty targeting, towards a life cycle approach, which looks at specific vulnerabilities at each life cycle of a person. And some of the specific vulnerabilities are, for instance, at childhood. One of my policy recommendations for many years now has been to push for a universal child grant, because that is an incredibly sensitive period, but also it is actually the lowest and cheapest investment with the highest ROI.
Exactly, because that's where you actually are able to intervene on a national policy level if you want to be able to address childhood stunting, malnutrition, and the entire dimension of adulthood issues that comes along with. It's also very interesting to note that of our e-invoicing rollout will be able to reflect real-time income, but cliff edges, once again, they risk hurting families when they move perhaps just even a couple of ringgit amongst income classes. So there's much to be pondered over here, and also the action does need to be taken, perhaps modeling from OECD countries where they actually have a grace period for cutoffs from targeted subsidies, so that there is enough time to actually measure qualitatively and quantitatively whether or not a family ought to be definitively moved into a different income class. Yeah, lots to say over there. But Vaishnavi, going into looking a little broader and casting the net with an eye towards what will be rolling out later this month in September, we've also got the RON 95 targeting due later. And what lessons from SARA's 100 ringgit My Card rollout could be perhaps baked into fuel subsidies before the time actually comes?
Thank you, Tamina. So if you think about it, the SARA rollout is already showing us a lot of valuable lessons. Even though well-intentioned, there's always areas for improvement, right?
Sure.
So the most important is that single-channel systems are quite fragile and they don't necessarily work. So when demand surged on day one for the SARA program, terminals struggled and the trust was affected. So these are exactly the kinds of frustrations we want to move away from at petrol stations when the RON 95 subsidies do come in at the end of the month. So where volumes are going to be far higher, people coming to petrol stations, and also where emotions might run a little bit hotter, right? So some lessons that can be directly applied to the RON 95 rollout from the SARA program is, let me take you in phases. So before the rollout, like the SARA program, one thing that we can gain from that is that we should ensure that MyCard holders can check their, if they are using the MyCard to check for eligibility, we should make sure that people can check their eligibility in advance, like how they did for the SARA program on the MyCard app or another official channel. Another thing is to publish clear eligibility criteria and maybe also a fact sheet well before the launch date. So answering questions like who is eligible, how do these quotas work, what if the pump times out, how do I redeem this? So these kind of questions that people will be asking before the day one, there should be a fact sheet that people can
preempt it in a sense.
So kind of make sure we answer these questions before people even have them. This will show preparedness on the government's end as well, which increases public trust, right? So clear messaging prevents resentment and also confusion. And finally, we could also conduct load tests and simulations for the first day surges, so weaknesses can be addressed ahead of time so that we can identify the gaps and give solutions based on whatever gaps there are. And then let me take you during the rollout. So during the rollout, we can consider a staggered launch, similarly to a thing that we could have done for the SARA program, right? Making sure we staggered the launch in terms of region or even ID number to reduce pressure on the system like we did see for the SARA program.
It's interesting because if you want to be staggering it according to IC numbers, you could very easily ensure that those who are elderly, for example, would be the ones to be able to get first in line. Right?
Yes, correct. So, and then actually one of the most important thing that I think is important is to train frontline petrol staff, which they could have done for the SARA program, to train cash registers, mighty employees, all these essential workers, so that they know how to respond when people encounter problems. And I think when they see the preparedness that these staff members have, they will naturally have the trust in the government and trust in the system. So the way frontline workers handle these issues can make the difference between public frustration and confidence. And then finally, after the rollout, we can provide clear entitlements at the nozzle. So for example, showing how many liters or how many ringgit is left in your benefits, maybe set in the receipt that you get at the nozzle, or even an SMS that can be sent to
an automated system.
So that kind of shows them how much they have left, and also it encourages transparency and trust and helps people self-manage and self-ration. So the principle is that engineer trust by design. So with strong systems, transparent communication, and also prepared frontline support, Malaysia can avoid the frustration seen during SARA's first days and instead demonstrate competence and care.
Exactly. So there's much to be learnt about it, but at the same time, I think what's really important is having it inbuilt into the system to have offline backup, because potentially speaking, it's going to be a very different scenario unfolding at petrol pumps versus at supermarket or store checkout registers. Derek, let's go deeper from cash to outcomes. Let's say if a rollout such as SARA, either 100 ringgit or otherwise, becomes a quarterly disbursement. So what real difference could it actually make over time, and actually even very quickly in the short term, to child nutrition or stunting rates? Because this is, of course, an issue that you have long worked on.
Yeah, thank you for that, Tamina. I think the value of SARA isn't exactly its function as a welfare aid. Again, RM100 is a small amount, and now it's a one-off. The value is it's an experiment for how we can launch these kind of welfare aid programs in the future. And of course, one of it, like I mentioned, is pushing for a universal child grant, right? It's giving us a lot of valuable lessons in how we can roll out the mechanisms, and especially looking at program delivery and design. And my opinion is that the current system is actually too complicated, you know? if we want to really impact outcomes such as child nutrition, child stunting, of which in Malaysia we have 1 in 5 children under the age 2 who are stunted, a number that is higher than some African countries even, right? We need to move from one-off aid that targets just the poor to something more universal, as I've been mentioning. So to just move to quarterly wouldn't really move the needle. And because, for instance, child stunting happens in the first 1,000 days. That is the most critical, crucial window of a child's life. But instead of making, SARA a quarterly thing, we can actually use SARA's mechanism of universal payments and use it to implement a universal child grant but we need to increase the frequency, right? So what we are doing with SARA isn't actually about the 100 ringgit itself, but it's about mainstreaming the idea that we should give universally. And for me, that can start with giving to children. Give it to children who are 0 to 2 years of age, which is the most sensitive time in a child's period of growth. Give it monthly, give it 100 ringgit, or I would say higher, but otherwise give it monthly without restrictions, and you can give it to mothers, right? And what you can do then is you can really see effects that really impact the growth of a child, but also the productivity of a nation in the future.
Exactly, and it's all about measurable outcomes as well. So perhaps mechanisms that may encourage more consistent universal rollout and allocations for children, Derek. What might you recommend? Perhaps maybe a pilot study that tracks maybe dietary diversity and actually shows us, perhaps month on month and quarter on quarter, how this target group of children are actually faring better.
I think in the ideal, right, systems like that are great, but like I said, they're really complicated, complex, and highly expensive. Instead, I think we need to trust parents to make the right decisions. And data from all over the world where there have been universal child grants show that when given an amount of money, even when there are no conditions attached to it, that you have to spend it a certain way, parents actually spend it on their children. Right? And what we're doing here for a welfare system, like I mentioned, is to meet the people at their place of need. And raising a child has many different pain points. It's not just nutrition, right? Sometimes it's education. Sometimes it's having toys in the house. And there's been studies that looked at how stunting rates will actually improve if there's simply the fact that toys exist in the house. Whereas if you talk to someone else, they may say that you can't use SARA to buy toys because that's not essential.
Very true. It's actually about looking at development as a holistic arc rather than just looking at it, all right, food on the table, but is it just rice, bread, etc.? Very well said indeed. Vaishnavi, let's dig deeper into looking at privacy as well as, of course, dignity of those involved and whose data is being collated. So how do we target help perhaps more precisely without turning low-income Malaysians into data points who are just tracked across agencies? Because, of course, what Derek has just told us about, that would be the ideal big picture to be moving towards. But let's focus on where we're at right now.
I think this is a very crucial question to ask, right, as Malaysia moves towards a more digital safety net. So SARA has shown how targeted support can be delivered at a large scale, but the challenge is balancing precision with, like you said, dignity, privacy, and trust. So the risk is over centralized databases is that people feel reduced to just mere statistics, and we're much more than that. We're human. So a single outdated entry like maybe a car ownership or even an old address, all of this could wrongly disqualify a household, and these are instances we want to move away from. So communities may also feel like they are under a lot of constant surveillance, reinforcing a stigma that they are that older recipients and rural families may not have the literacy to access or challenge their records if mistakes occur. So instead, what we can think about, we recommend a less intrusive and more practical approach. So we could collect only the minimum necessary data, so like household income band or even household income size, avoiding overreach. A better thing to do is also to use proxy indicators. So like Derek mentioned earlier, using maybe data like electricity usage or even school aid enrollment and health clinic records, using these kind of data to see which households need this kind of aid without having to cross-check every single data point or across every single ministry. And also empowering community-level validation, right? Talking to village heads, penghulus, resident committees, all of this to confirm eligibility, building transparency, and also shared ownership among government and the public. At the end of the day, I think when you increase public-private partnership and also collaboration, this will only build trust among government and the people. And that is what we want at the end of the day. So also designing systems where eligibility data expires automatically and there is a need to re-verify annually. So this ensures that we reduce the sense of long-term surveillance for people. And at the same time, we should also recognize that cash aid is never really a bad thing. It gives households the flexibility and respects their ability to make choices for themselves and for their families. Because at the end of the day, like Derek mentioned, families know best about their own financial situations and their own bills. So with the budget coming up, right, this is also an opportunity to explore expansion of cash-based assistance, either by increasing the amount or even widening the categories to include other essential items like raw food, vegetables, meats, fruits, to ensure aid remains relevant and responsive. The aim is to be precise and fair while making people feel supported but not surveilled.
Understanding that relative perishability of foods also quite often leads into those being the more nutritious ones on the plate, right?
Yeah.
So moving into closing out the discussion though, Derek, let's look at safeguards before scaling. So let's say before this, a similar system or an improved one is used for fuel or even healthcare subsidies, what basic checks and balances need to already be in place for the policymakers to definitely have in mind?
I think instead of checks and balances, I am all for actually simplifying it.
Simplifying.
So currently we have 14 approved categories, like I said. Abolish them, you know, and let people make the decision as to what they want to purchase. If the government is concerned about temptation goods, cigarettes, alcohol, vape, have one single restricted category, and then that's it.
Simplify it, absolutely.
Simplify it.
And yes, be cognizant that that
Correct.
is an area that you want to ensure does not.
And the other recommendation I will make is that instead of the current credit system, we should actually use actual cash transfers. And of course, that can be leveraged using existing e-wallet platforms or just a simple do it now or using digital bank transfers. Let the cash be given out directly so that, and that also avoids system crashes, because when you have cash, it's up to the individual how they want to spend it, where they want to spend it. And here's the thing about cash, it has a really powerful multiplier effect that could really uplift SMEs, you know, small businesses, not just chain business that are providers that are registered under the SARA program. So I think instead of looking at restricting the program even more, we should actually look at loosening it, because that also avoids a lot of the problems that we've been seeing with SARA. One of the things that people point out is that they don't know what items are included in the 14 categories. They go into the shops, they ask the shopkeeper, and sometimes it even has the My Kasih or SARA logo, but that's not listed in the barcode. In fact, there is an app that exists for you to scan the barcode to see whether that item is included or not. Why all these hurdles, right? Simplify it, make it easy, empower the rakyat to make the decisions that are best for them. And in fact, when you decentralize this decision-making, it actually costs less than building this kind of expensive system.
Because centralization clearly has deep fragilities that have already been exposed. So let's widen that net and also the coverage. Vishnavi, stopping out from stopgap to safety net. So if the SARA is to outlive its 100 ringgit headline, what roadmap, in brief, would you propose to make it lasting as a safety net and one which we can build on?
Yeah, so SARA has already shown its potential by expanding beyond a one-off 100 ringgit gesture to target monthly assistance up to 2,100 ringgit annually for poor and hardcore poor households by broadening access to Sabah and Sarawak. So the next step is ensuring that this evolves into a permanent trusted safety net. So in terms of like in immediate terms, in terms of stabilization and restoring trust in the system, we should guarantee that reliability by fixing transaction glitches and preventing these long queues either in petrol fuel pumps or even in grocery stores, ensuring that the ease of accessibility is there. And also publishing real-time dashboards, so like I mentioned, showing uptake, success rates, and also incident resolutions to gain back public trust in the system. And adjusting the benefits to reflect inflation baskets of food and fuel so that the value of the cash rate is not eroded. And providing easy appeal channels for households to update their eligibility or even correct the eligibility if they are not eligible but feel as if they need to. And then in the medium term, broadening and deepening support, we can diversify the benefits into food vouchers, school supply credits, utility rebates, and not just cash. So like what Derek mentioned, instead of putting more restrictions, let's widen it. Let's make it more inclusive to all these other areas where people have a lot more financial needs above just groceries and fuels, because that's not just what we need in our lives, right?
That's right.
Then linking SARA to skills training, micro enterprise support, childcare subsidies, so it becomes a bridge and not just a transfer.
And perhaps even areas for exploring microfinance in the future. Derek, Vishnavi, thank you very much for the very rich discussion. Well, if Malaysia gets this right, we won't just be talking about one-off handouts, but about a permanent digital infrastructure that can potentially deliver fuel, healthcare, even nutrition support, a dignified safety net with precision and trust. The question we leave you with, is SARA the first step in a subsidy revolution, or will it be remembered as a one-hit wonder? That's all we have time for today. See you again next week with more economic analysis and insights. I'm Tamina Cowstry signing off for now. Here's to a productive week ahead. Right, so we're just in the background.